Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a place wrapped in gold desert dust and just enough myth to keep scholars arguing for centuries. Ancient Egypt. You already know the pyramids, the mummies, and the god with animal heads. But tonight we're not looking at the grand monuments or the endless dynasties carved in stone. Tonight we're peering into something quieter, something closer to the ordinary people and their private lives. Their marriages, their jealousies, their love poetry, and the sometimes awkward way they blended daily survival with sex, family, and religion. Because beneath all the glory of ancient Egypt, there were just people. People who worried about in-laws, who sometimes married badly, and who definitely had awkward family dinners. So let's dim the lights. Let's slow down our thoughts and drift along the Nile in the company of history. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not the kind of spectacle we imagine. If you picture trumpets, sacred priests, golden processions, and vows in front of temple gods, you might be surprised. The reality was much simpler. For most Egyptians, marriage was essentially an agreement. Two families agreed. A dowry was settled. The couple began living together. That was it. Married. No priest needed to bless it. No government clerk needed to stamp it. It was more practical than ceremonial, more about life functioning smoothly than making a dramatic public statement. Which is not to say Egyptians were cold or unromantic. They wrote some of the oldest surviving love poetry in human history. But the legal framework of marriage was less about passion and more about property. If you read a marriage contract from ancient Egypt, you don't find lines about eternal devotion. You find careful notes about who keeps which jars of beer if the union ends. It's pragmatic to the point of comedy. Imagine standing in your wedding clothes and signing a document that specifies you'll get half the household grain in case of divorce. Very romantic indeed. But romance did exist. Egyptian love poems are startlingly tender, filled with longing and humor. One poem has a young man confess that he cannot tell if he is alive or dead when he sees the girl he adores. Another has a woman declaring she wishes she were his laundryman, so she could wash his clothes and be near him every day. These lines are simple, but they pulse with the same restless, slightly silly energy of modern love songs. They don't sound so different from us, except for the occasional mention of fetching water or carrying baskets to the canal. For Egyptians, everyday chores were fertile ground for romance. Nothing says devotion like offering to haul your beloved's laundry through the dust. Still, for most marriages, love was never the central purpose. Marriage meant survival. It meant households joined together. It meant land and inheritance remained stable. Families didn't want the Nile farmland drifting off to some unrelated neighbor, so they arranged marriages with a careful eye to economics, which explains why Egyptian texts about marriage are full of legal clauses about property and almost never about feelings. Love was the background music. Grain and goats were the main concern. Sex itself, in Egyptian thought, was not whispered about or hidden away. It was ordinary and it was divine. Fertility was sacred. The act of creating life was not dirty or shameful. It was cosmic. The gods themselves modeled it, though not always in ways we would describe at family gatherings. The creator god Adam, according to myth, brought the first gods into being through an act of solitary effort. The entire universe, said the priests, sprang from Adam's private determination. Priests recited this solemnly, and the audience accepted it with reverence. The fact that humanity owed its existence to what was essentially the earliest recorded solitary activity didn't strike them as funny. For us, though, it's hard not to imagine some very serious priest chanting about this cosmic moment while the crowd kept perfectly straight faces. This open connection between sex and creation meant Egyptian art, and myth had no problem showing what later societies would consider scandalous. The gods Isis and Osiris were siblings and also partners. Geb and Nut, the earth and sky, were siblings and lovers. Divine incest was everywhere in Egyptian myth, which is one reason pharaohs decided it was perfectly fine to marry their own sisters. If the gods did it, why shouldn't the rulers? Ordinary Egyptians did not usually follow this pattern. A farmer might marry a neighbor, a craftsman might with a girl from the next village, but the royal family, the royal family, loved to keep things in the family. The result was dynasties with family trees that looked more like tangled fishing nets. Sibling marriage among royals wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. It was painted, carved, ritualized. Pharaoh marrying sister wasn't scandal. It was divine imitation. It kept the throne within the family and echoed the sacred union of Isis and Osiris. It also, inevitably, concentrated the gene pool into a very small puddle. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, perfected this tradition. Cleopatra herself married two of her brothers. That's not awkward at all. Imagine running a kingdom, while also trying not to argue with your sibling about who left sandals in the wrong place. Family dinners must have been tense. Outside the royal palaces, most marriages were monogamous. Divorce was not unusual and not even scandalous. A woman could leave her husband, and the law spelled out what she would take with her. Clothing, jewelry, sometimes half the household's grain. Women in ancient Egypt had more legal rights than many later societies would grant. They could own land. They could inherit. They could sue in court. They could run businesses. There's a papyrus where a woman sues her own husband for failing to provide for her, and the court treats her case seriously. Imagine that in medieval Europe, where a woman was often considered legally part of her husband's property. Egypt, in this way, was astonishingly progressive. Still, the law was not perfectly fair. Adultery, for example, carried different consequences depending on gender. A woman caught in adultery could be divorced, disgraced, punished. A man could stray far more easily without fear. Pharaohs, of course, were exempt from nearly all rules. If you're the living son of the sun god, you can justify almost anything, which explains the royal harems. Dozens of wives, concubines, attendants, all requiring a small army of officials to manage the logistics. Imagine being the scribe responsible for attendance in the pharaoh's harem. A life's work spent recording who slept where, who was favored, who quarreled. Somewhere in the Egyptian afterlife, a bureaucrat is still sharpening his reed pen and sighing. For the ordinary couple, life was simpler. A mud brick home near the river, reed mats for beds, clay pots and the smell of baking bread. The wife grinding grain, brewing beer, raising children. The husband plowing, fishing, weaving. They shared labor, meals, chores. Tomb art sometimes shows a husband and wife seated side by side, arms over shoulders, sharing bread. It looks almost modern in its quiet intimacy. Love here was not grand or ceremonial. It was practical, steady, affectionate. But jealousy still crept in. Some love poems are tinged with envy, with longing for someone already promised to another. I see him walking with her. I am ill with desire, writes one poet. A young man, aching with jealousy, carving his heartbreak into papyrus. He couldn't know that his words would survive 3 millennia, to be read by strangers lying in bed with smartphones. The human heart changes very little. We fret, we long, we grow jealous. The settings change, the clothing changes, but the feelings are strangely eternal. And so, lying here tonight, you might wonder, if you had been born in Egypt, would you have chosen a marriage for love or for survival? Would you have followed your parents' decision or risked defiance for the sake of your heart? Tell me in the comments. Would you have chosen romance or the security of land and grain? And with that soft question, we'll pause at the end of part 1. The Nile still flows. Ahead of us lie tales of jealous queens, fertility rituals that blur the line between divine myth and human awkwardness, and dynasties so tangled with themselves they nearly collapsed under the weight of their own family dinners. But for now, close your eyes if you haven't already, and let the current of history carry you a little deeper into rest. Let's drift onward, still floating with the Nile, that ancient river that carried not only crops and goods, but also the rhythm of Egyptian life. If marriage was a foundation of family, then fertility was a divine seal on that foundation. A marriage without children was seen as incomplete, almost broken. To the Egyptians, children weren't just helpful for farm work or future security in old age. They were proof that the universe itself was in balance. A couple without children wasn't only unlucky, They might have been cosmically out of tune, which meant that fertility rituals, charms, prayers, and sometimes desperate measures were woven into everyday life. We can imagine households quietly worrying if too much time passed without a pregnancy. They might visit a temple, whispering prayers to Hathor, goddess of love and fertility. They might wear amulets shaped like frogs, because frogs, with their abundant little tadpoles, were symbols of fertility. Women seeking conception sometimes slept with charms in the shape of the dwarf god Bes, a deity who looked rather like a lion with short legs and a comic grimace. He wasn't glamorous, but he was protective, and families kept him close. In a world without modern medicine, small gods feel big anxieties. Of course, fertility myths weren't just about hope. They were also political tools. Pharaohs declared that their virility mirrored the sun itself. If the sun rose reliably each day, then naturally the pharaoh's vigor was unmatched. One inscription from Ramesses II practically brags about his fertility, claiming he fathered over 100 children, which may or may not be true, but one suspects his royal scribes weren't in the habit of fact-checking the king's boasts. Still, the image of a ruler overflowing with children projected strength. A virile king was a powerful king. It meant Egypt would continue forever like the Nile. Harems played into this image of fertility and abundance. To us, the word harem might conjure visions of luxury, silks, reclining women. But in Egypt, the harem was a highly organized institution, part domestic, part political, part religious. It wasn't just about sex. It was about alliances, heirs, and managing a complex household that could rival a small village. The pharaoh's harem included wives, concubines, daughters, servants, musicians, and attendants. It required cooks, guards, scribes, overseers. Imagine the logistics of feeding, clothing, and managing hundreds of people, all within the delicate politics of who was favored and who was ignored. A harem was essentially a royal factory of affection and intrigue. And of course, with that many people in close quarters, scandals were inevitable. One of the most famous involved Ramesses III, whose reign ended in the so-called harem conspiracy. One of his wives, plotting to place her son on the throne, recruited attendants and officials in a coup attempt. They tried to kill the pharaoh. It failed, but Ramesses was badly injured, and court records preserve the messy aftermath, trials, punishments, even suicides. Imagine bedtime in that harem. Behind the silks and incense, whispers of treachery echoed. It shows that even in a world of gods and gold, palace drama was never far from soap opera. But ordinary families were not running harems. Their fertility worries were more basic. Am I fertile? Is my spouse? How do we ensure children? Ancient Egyptians turned to a blend of folk remedies and ritual practices. Some were surprisingly practical. They had early forms of pregnancy tests, involving barley and wheat seeds sprinkled with a woman's urine. If the seed sprouted, pregnancy was likely. It sounds bizarre, but modern tests have shown it could actually work with some accuracy. Others' methods were less reliable. There are recipes involving crocodile dung used as contraceptives, which must have been both uncomfortable and, one suspects, not particularly effective. But in a world without modern science, experimentation was desperate and creative. When children did arrive, they were adored. Tombs show mothers holding infants, fathers playing with toddlers. Small ivory dolls survive, carved with moving limbs, treasured by children who lived thousands of years ago. Parents might place protective amulets around their babies' necks, invoking gods to guard against illness. Childhood was precious, but it was also fragile. Infant mortality was high. Families could never be certain how many children would survive, which only made the pressure on fertility all the more intense. Still, sexuality in Egypt was not all about children. There was playfulness, too. Erotic imagery appears in papyri, sometimes comical, sometimes frankly startling. One famous papyrus, known today as the Turin-erotic papyrus, shows scenes that would make even the most open-minded museum-goer blush. It's often called the world's oldest piece of pornography. Scholars debate whether it was meant as serious entertainment or as satire, but either way, it shows that Egyptians were not nearly as prudish as later cultures like to pretend. The same society that built solemn temples also sketched decidedly less solemn scenes on papyrus. People, after all, contain multitudes. Within marriage, affection was expected. Wives were often described in inscriptions as beloved, and husbands sometimes addressed them as sister. Not because they were literally related, though in royal circles that could be true, but because brother and sister carried connotations of closeness, of intimacy. To call your wife sister was to signal she was your equal, your companion, part of your very being. It was a linguistic quirk that made sense in their context, though to us it may sound confusing. But marriage could also fracture. Divorce was straightforward, if not painless. A man could dismiss his wife, or a wife could leave her husband, and the division property was settled by contract. There was no eternal damnation attached to divorce, no stigma of sin. It was an accepted, if unfortunate, part of life, which, in a strange way, feels modern. Marriages ended. People moved on. Life went forward. Among the elites, however, marriage was political dynamite. Queens held power not only as consorts, but as symbols. A pharaoh's wife was not simply his partner. She was the embodiment of Hathor on earth. She played roles in ritual, in diplomacy, in succession, which meant her behavior, her fertility. Even her popularity mattered to the stability of the kingdom. Jealousy, betrayal, and rivalry among queens could shake dynasties. The quiet politics of bedrooms often spilled into the public stage. And then, of course, there was Cleopatra. Though she lived much later than the golden age of pharaohs, she represents the culmination of Egyptian royal marriage politics. She married her brothers, not because she wanted to, but because it was expected. She took Roman lovers, not only for passion, but for strategy. Her life was a blend of personal desire and ruthless political calculation. Marriage and sex were never private for her. They were tools of survival, diplomacy, and legacy. In her, the personal and political collided spectacularly. But Cleopatra was hardly unique. Egyptian history is full of queens and princesses who navigated the dangerous waters of dynastic marriage. Some succeeded, some failed, some became mothers of pharaohs. Others vanished into the silence of history. Behind every monumental statue of a king, there were women negotiating the quieter, but no less critical realm of marriage. When we step back, the picture of Egyptian sexuality and marriage is layered. On one hand, practical contracts, property rights, divorces settled with lists of clothing and jars of beer. On the other, tender poems about love, yearning, jealousy. On one level, gods modeling cosmic fertility in shockingly explicit myths. On another, families whispering prayers for a child to survive infancy. It was all there, woven together, ordinary and extraordinary. And through it all, the Egyptians carried a sense of ease about sex that later cultures lost. They didn't hide it. They didn't label it sinful. They treated it as part of life, as essential as the Nile. It could be sacred, it could be playful, it could be messy, but it was always there, part of the flow of existence. So if you close your eyes and imagine yourself back in that world, would you have felt freer in such a society? Freer to love, to divorce, to speak openly to desire? Or would the weight of family expectations and dynastic politics have pressed down on you just the same? Tell me in the comments, would ancient Egypt have felt liberating or suffocating? And with that question, we pause at then part 2. The Nile still drifts on. Ahead of us lie darker tales. Jealous queens whose rivalries turned deadly, royal children born into webs of intrigue, and dynasties so obsessed with purity that they nearly destroyed themselves. Let's drift onward again, following the soft flow of the Nile and the endless repetition of dynasties. By now, we've seen how marriage in Egypt was a curious mixture of paperwork and poetry, of contracts and charms. But if marriage held society together, then incest, yes, the royal variety, was what kept the dynasties glued into increasingly odd shapes. Because, of course, when you tell yourself your bloodline is divine, the next step is refusing to dilute it. And so, Egyptian royalty developed a fondness for marrying siblings that was both practical and, frankly, a little disastrous. The logic made sense to them. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was a god on earth. His sister was by extension divine too. Put them together in marriage, and you doubled the sanctity. The result was a union of cosmic order. The earthly mirror the gods Osiris and Isis, who, in mythology, were both siblings and spouses. The symbolism was too perfect to resist. Unfortunately, genetics didn't agree. Sibling marriage among royals appeared especially in the later dynasties and peaked with the Ptolemies, those Greek rulers who inherited Egypt after Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies took sibling marriage to such extremes that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled wreath. Cleopatra herself married two of her brothers, both teenage kings, which must have been about as delightful as sharing a bedroom with someone you used to squabble with over toys. It wasn't personal choice. It was duty. The result was a dynasty brimming with rivalries, murders, and a gene pool that looked increasingly shallow. But even before the Ptolemies, Egyptian pharaohs weren't shy about marrying close kin. Half-sisters, cousins, nieces. It was all considered acceptable in the royal household. The justification was clear: land, titles, wealth, and above all, the image of divine purity. A wife from outside the royal family might dilute the magic. So the marriages stayed inside again and again. It's little wonder that many royal children were sickly, fragile, or lived very short lives. The gods may have approved, but nature often rebelled. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians were not following this pattern. For them, sibling marriage was rare and frowned upon, except occasionally in isolated communities or during the Roman period when census records suggest it might have happened more often. But by and large, the average farmer wasn't rushing to marry his sister. That particular practice was a privilege, if we can call it that, of the royals. In this way, ordinary people probably looked up at their rulers with a mix of awe and confusion. Divine they might be, but sane? Perhaps not always. Still, the idea of the ideal couple lingered in the shadow of the gods. Osiris and Isis, brother and sister, set the mythological model. Their love story was famous. Isis resurrected Osiris after his murder, reassembled his body, and conceived their son Horus, who would avenge his father. It was a tale of love, loyalty, and persistence, less awkward in myth, perhaps, than in practice. But the Egyptians adored the story. It gave divine cover to royal unions that, on a purely human level, must have felt uncomfortable at best. The royal household was therefore a stage where sex, politics, and theology collided. Each new queen, whether sister, cousin, or foreign bride, carried enormous weight. Her womb was not hers alone, it was the state's. Her children weren't simply her children. They were heirs, gods in waiting, which meant that jealousy, infertility, or rivalry could spiral into national crises. A barren queen was not just pitted. She was dangerous to stability. A fertile queen could become the most powerful figure in Egypt. Behind the throne, the politics of marriage were relentless. Take, for example, the Amarna period with Pharaoh Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti. Their marriage appears, on the surface, surprisingly tender. Reliefs show them kissing their daughters, playing as a family, showing affection rarely depicted so openly in Egyptian art. Some scholars argue this was Akhenaten's strange religious revolution spilling into his personal life. Worship of one god, the Aten, reflected in a new intimacy at home. Or perhaps he simply liked Nefertiti, which is not impossible. Though in the world of royal politics, genuine affection was usually an optional extra. Their children, however, became pawns in succession struggles, and after Akhenaten's death, the dynasty dissolved into chaos. Tenderness was never a guarantee of stability. And then there was Tutankhamun, that boy king whose golden tomb dazzled modern archaeologists. His marriage was not so dazzling. He wed his half-sister Ankhesenamun, continuing the tradition of dynastic intimacy. The results were tragic. Studies of their mummified fetuses suggest that the children were stillborn, possibly due to the accumulation of genetic issues from generations of inbreeding. The boy king himself was frail, plagued by health problems, and died young. His marriage was less a love story than a biological case study in why narrowing a gene pool is never wise. It's easy to look back with modern eyes and shake our heads, but for the Egyptians, this was sacred order. Their cosmos was fragile, and incestuous marriages were part of how they thought they preserved it. And yet, beneath the divine rhetoric, there must have been whispers, concubines waiting resentfully, children with deformities quietly hidden. rival queens plotting in the shadows. The mythology of eternal love between brother and sister was elegant. The reality was probably tense, jealous, and full of human misery. Meanwhile, ordinary marriages kept rolling along with their contracts and dowries and occasional divorces. Everyday people weren't reciting cosmic myths to justify their unions. They were worrying about rent, bread, and whether their partner would stop spending so much time talking to the neighbor. In that sense, they lived far more like us than their pharaohs did, which raises a quiet question. If you lived in Egypt, would you prefer the ordinary marriage, simple and grounded, or the royal one, dripping with divine symbols but suffocating under expectations? Tell me in the comments which path you'd choose, the farmer's freedom or the pharaoh's gilded cage. But before we drift too far into speculation, let's circle back to the question of sex itself. Egyptian art, for the most part, kept depictions of sex subtle. Lovers are shown embracing, holding hands, standing side by side. Explicit imagery was reserved for private papyri or magical spells. This restraint in public art may have made the more graphic materials all the more shocking. Imagine stumbling upon the Turin papyrus after looking at centuries of statues of serene, dignified couples. Suddenly, there it is, acrobatic encounters that would challenge even the most flexible yogi. Perhaps it was a kind of comic relief for scribes after long days of copying tax records. Or perhaps it was a more serious exploration of desire. Either way, it shows that Egyptians weren't shy when they wanted to be. Even language reflected this mixture of frankness and delicacy. Love poems often describe desire through metaphors: lotus flowers blooming, rivers overflowing, fish swimming. At the same time, medical texts could be strikingly blunt about anatomy and function. It depended on the context. Sacred hymns wrapped sexuality in divine mystery. Doctors described it in clinical detail. And somewhere between, ordinary people gossiped about who was flirting with whom at the marketplace. In that gossip lay the real life of marriage: petty jealousies, rivalries, suspicions. Divorce records sometimes include complaints of mistreatment, neglect, or simple incompatibility. One papyrus mentions a husband who failed to provide clothing for his wife, which sounds less like a cosmic crisis and more like a case of laziness. Another case hints at infidelity, a reminder that desire often spilled outside the neat lines of contracts. Egyptian society accepted divorce, but that didn't mean it was painless. Hearts could be broken just as easily under the Egyptian sun as anywhere else. And then there were widows. A woman whose husband died could inherit property, manage estates, even run businesses. In that sense, widowhood opened a door to independence that marriage often closed. Some women thrived in this role. Others remarried quickly, seeking security. In both cases, widowhood reveals how fluid gender roles could be, depending on circumstance. Egyptian women had more legal rights than many of their counterparts in later civilizations. Marriage bound them, but widowhood could free them. Through all these stories, one thing is clear: sex and marriage in ancient Egypt were never just private affairs. They were mirrors of the cosmos, tools of politics, and sources of endless human drama. To study them is to see a culture that was both very alien and surprisingly familiar. Their gods might have had animal heads and cosmic fertility myths, but their worries about love, children, loyalty are ours too. So as we pause here, ask yourself, if you could slip back into ancient Thebes or Memphis, sit on the stars by the Nile, and listen to an Egyptian tell you about their marriage, what would you want to ask first? Would you ask about love, about jealousy, about children, or about the gods? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd love to know which part of their world intrigues you most. And with that, we close part 3. Ahead lie even stranger tales, rituals to test fidelity, spells to attract lovers, and the sometimes comical lengths Egyptians want to keep their partners faithful. But for now, let's drift, calm and steady, into the next part when you're ready. Let's ease ourselves forward again, floating gently through the sands and stones of Egypt, where temples cast long shadows and marriage vows mix with magical charms. By now, we've seen how family ties could bend into strange shapes among the royals, how fertility was treated like a cosmic duty, and how ordinary couples carried contracts in their satchels like we might carry a grocery list. But there's another side to Egyptian love and marriage, one steeped in spells, rituals, and the never-ending human urge to control something as unpredictable as desire. Because as much as marriage was a contract, affection was never guaranteed. People worried about being unloved, or worse, replaced. And in a culture where gods had a say in everything from flooding rivers to successful harvests, of course Egyptians turned to magic for their relationships too. Love spells were common, tucked into papyri or whispered at shrines. Some were simple prayers, "Make her heart yearn for me." Others were more forceful, involving figurines, not tying in elaborate rituals under the moonlight. There's one spell preserved that basically says, "May she not eat, may she not drink, until she comes to me," which, while passionate, feels more like coercion than romance. The ancients, it seems, were not always subtle in matters of love. Infidelity was another concern. While Egyptian marriage contracts didn't forbid love affairs outright, the assumption was clear. Fidelity was expected. And so, protective charms against wandering spouses circulated. One spell called on divine punishment for any wife who strayed. Another placed a kind of magical lock on a husband, ensuring he couldn't be seduced by another woman. These charms reflect the same insecurities we'd recognize today. When love feels uncertain, humans reach for whatever tools they have, whether that's long, suspicious text messages in our era, or crocodile fat ointments and amulets in theirs. What's fascinating is how frank Egyptians could be about desire. One surviving him, the Hathor, the goddess of love, doesn't shy away from the details of longing. It describes the sweetness of physical affection, the joy of closeness, the way love can intoxicate more than wine. These weren't whispered in shame. They were celebrated, even sung in public festivals. Picture crowds of people swaying with music, praising Hathor, clapping the drums, celebrating fertility and joy with abandon. It was noisy, lively, and probably far less dignified than we like to imagine when we picture pyramids and solemn statues. Egypt, in reality, was alive with laughter, music, and yes, plenty of flirting. Marriage, though, had its share of darker corners. Polygamy, while not common for ordinary folk, was practiced by the wealthy and, of course, by the pharaohs. For the average farmer, supporting one wife and a handful of children was already a challenge. Bread and beer didn't multiply just because you took on extra partners. But for the rich, more wives meant more alliances, more children, more influence. Yet, one suspects also meant more rivalries, more jealous looks across courtyards, more whispered complaints to servants. Imagine a nobleman with 3 wives, each vying for attention, each trying to secure better futures for her children. Domestic bliss was not always the outcome. We also find curious rituals around fertility and fidelity. There are magical tests preserved in texts meant to reveal if a woman had been faithful. One involved placing a certain plant in her body and watching for reactions, a crude and frankly invasive method. Another relied on interpreting dreams after rituals. Of course, none of these were reliable, but they reflect the same anxious desire for certainty that people still crave in relationships. Jealousy is timeless, and humans have always invented ways, usually flawed ones, to try and soothe it. And then there are the festivals. Egyptians loved festivals. These were times when ordinary rules bent, and communities came together for food, music, and dancing. Some festivals had explicitly sexual overtones, celebrating fertility and renewal. The Festival of Hathor, for instance, involved drunkenness, music, and what we might politely call festive mingling. During the Opet festival in Thebes, statues of gods were paraded down the Nile, and behind the sacred processions, the crowds enjoyed days of feasting, drinking, and intimacy. These events blurred the line between sacred ritual and earthly pleasure. It wasn't debauchery, at least not in their eyes. It was life-affirming, a reminder that joy and desire were as much divine gifts as sunlight and rain. Royalty, of course, participated too, though with more ceremony. A queen might be seen at a festival, her appearance itself a symbol of fertility and beauty. Priests carried statues of gods and goddesses into dark chambers, reenacting cosmic unions that supposedly kept the world in balance. It was theater, yes, but theater with deep meaning. The message was simple. Sex was not dirty. It was divine. It wasn't just tolerated. it was celebrated. Which brings us to one of the more unusual aspects of Egyptian sexuality, their medical papyri. These texts include recipes for contraception and fertility aids that range from surprisingly logical to deeply questionable. We already mentioned crocodile dung as a barrier method. Less pungent options included honey, acacia, and natron, substances that may have had some spermicidal qualities. Whether they actually worked is another matter, but the effort itself shows awareness. Egyptians knew pregnancy wasn't inevitable. They experimented with prevention, even if the results were mixed at best. Pregnancy itself was surrounded with rituals and superstitions. Women gave birth seated on special birthing stools, often with images of protective gods carved into them. Friends and midwives surrounded the mother, chanting, encouraging, placing amulets to ward off evil spirits. The process was dangerous, as childbirth has always been, but it was also sacred. In their eyes, each birth repeated the cosmic creation, life emerging anew. And when the child arrived, the celebration echoed through households. Cradles rattled. Songs were sung. Protective charms hung above doorways. For a moment, all the worries of contracts and jealousy faded. Children, though cherished, were not entirely shielded from the practical side of life. They were quickly expected to help, fetching water, grinding grain, tending animals. Childhood was short, at least by modern standards. But love for children is written everywhere in Egyptian art. Fathers hold them close. Mothers feed them tenderly. Even gods are depicted nursing infants. Despite high infant mortality, families didn't distance themselves emotionally. They loved fully, even knowing loss was likely. There's a certain quiet courage in that, a refusal to let fear of loss prevent affection. Now, returning to the question of desire, we find an odd little detail about Egyptian beauty ideals. Men and women alike shaved their bodies, wore wigs, used perfumes and ointments. The desert heat encouraged cleanliness, yes, but there was also an aesthetic preference for smoothness and scent. Wigs were curled, braided, scented with oils. Paint, kohl, was applied thickly, not only for beauty but for practical reasons too, reducing glare from the sun and repelling flies. The result was a culture where appearance mattered deeply. To attract a partner, you might spend as much time preparing your wig as writing a love poem. Perhaps not much has changed. We even have playful letters where men flatter women with descriptions of their beauty. "Your voice is sweet," one writes. "Your arms are lovely and your thighs carry me away." Not exactly subtle, but certainly heartfelt. These were not stiff declarations. They were passionate, human, and often blunt. Imagine hearing that whispered in a courtyard by torchlight, with the Nile flowing quietly nearby. It's not hard to picture. The ancients, after all, were not so different from us. Yet, all this romance existed alongside the cold practicality of property. Marriage contracts spelled out exactly what a wife was owed if things went wrong. The tension between romance and economics ran through every union. Love poems might promise eternal devotion. Contracts promised jars of beer and sacks of grain, which mattered more depended on the day. So what do we make of it all? Egyptian sex and marriage were at once playful and serious, cosmic and practical. They believed love could intoxicate, but they also knew that households needed bread. They saw sex as sacred, but they also scribbled bawdy jokes on papyri. They celebrated fertility at festivals, yet quietly worried in their homes about whether crops would stretch through the year. The contradictions weren't contradictions to them. They were just life. And as you drift here with me, I'll leave you with a question. If you were an Egyptian scribe asked to copy a love spell, would you have written it with a straight face? Or would you have chuckled, knowing how messy human hearts really are? Would you take the spell seriously, or would you mutter under your breath that no amount of crocodile fat will fix a wandering eye? Tell me in the comments, because human skepticism, too, is timeless. And with that, we close part 4. Ahead lie even more curious tales. Dreams of the afterlife as eternal marriages, tomb inscriptions that read like love letters to eternity, and the way Egyptians imagined sex continuing after death. But for now, let's rest here, letting their songs of love and their jars of beer drift softly through your mind. Let's drift forward once more as the desert cools and the torches burn low, to another corner of Egyptian life that often slips under the radar: the connection between sex, marriage, and the afterlife. Because to Egyptians, love didn't end with death. Marriage, in their imagination, stretched beyond the tomb. A partner wasn't just a companion in life, but also in eternity, which was a lovely sentiment in theory. Unless, of course, you'd grown tired of your spouse after 30 years of bickering about grain rations. Then the prospect of spending eternity together might have seemed less comforting and more like cosmic punishment. But the inscriptions tell us again and again, husbands and wives wanted to be buried side by side. Tombs were decorated with images of couples embracing, offering food to one another, holding hands. Sometimes a husband is shown giving his wife flowers, or the wife playing a harp for her husband. These were not stiff, cold images. They radiate affection, even joy. It suggests that marriage was imagined not just as a social duty, but as a genuine bond. And while we can never be certain how much affection every couple shared in life, they want to project the idea of togetherness into eternity. There's even a sense of longing in some tomb texts. Husbands write that they hope their wives will join them in the field of reeds, that paradise of tall grasses, clear waters, and eternal abundance. They ask to eat bread together, to drink beer, to enjoy music. In short, they wanted heaven to feel like a continuation of marriage, hopefully on one of the better days, not the ones with arguments about who forgot to feed the goats. Sex itself was not excluded from this vision of the afterlife. The Egyptians had no qualms about imagining that love and desire continued beyond death. If life was good and sex was part of life, then why wouldn't it carry on in the hereafter? Some tomb paintings even hint at erotic undertones, with couples shown close together, clothed but suggestive, as if intimacy was part of eternal joy. For them, paradise wasn't a place of denial. It was a place of abundance, where food, drink, and love never ran dry. This attitude stands in sharp contrast to later cultures that linked sex with sin, shame, or temptation. The Egyptians saw it differently. It was a gift of the gods, part of Ma'at, the cosmic order. To deny it would have seemed odd, which means that for thousands of years, countless couples laid down at night believing that their bond wasn't only for this world, but for the next. There's something both comforting and slightly claustrophobic in that thought. Of course, not all marriages ended harmoniously. Divorce records, as we've already noted, prove that people parted ways, which raises a question. In their minds, did divorce carry into the afterlife too? If you divorce your husband in Thebes, would he still show up stubbornly in the field of reeds, demanding his half of the grain? The records are silent, but one suspects at least a few widows pray that the afterlife will be merciful enough to keep ex-husbands at a polite distance. The afterlife also gave rise to one of the strangest intersections of sex and religion: funerary fertility rituals. Some scholars suggest that during burial ceremonies, symbolic acts, sometimes even sexual in nature, were performed to ensure the rebirth of the deceased. The logic was that life springs from union, and so, to renew life after death, fertility had to be invoked. The details are murky, but there are hints in texts and images that sexuality was woven into the very fabric of resurrection. The god Osiris, after all, was brought back to life through Isis's intimate magic. If it worked for the gods, perhaps it worked for humans too. This intertwining of sex and eternity wasn't only symbolic, it was also deeply practical. A wife's role in funerary rituals was crucial. She performed ceremonies, offered prayers, and in some cases, played the role of Isis mourning Osiris. Without this, the deceased risked being lost in the afterlife. Marriage, therefore, was not just about companionship in life, but about ensuring survival after death. Choose your spouse poorly, and you might not make it a paradise. Imagine the pressure that put on wedding vows. But while these lofty cosmic ideas swirled around, daily life still plodded along with more mundane concerns. Let's not forget that love, while celebrated, could also sour. Let her survive where wives complained of neglect. In one, a wife scolds her absent husband, accusing him of failing to provide. It reads less like divine poetry and more like a passive-aggressive note left on the kitchen table. Egyptians, it seems, were not strangers to domestic squabbles. And yet, even these quarrels often end with pleas for reconciliation. Love was fragile but persistent, and when reconciliation didn't work, there was always the option of moving on. Divorce, as we've said, was accepted. The wife could return to her family, reclaim her dowry, and try again. There was no religious barrier, no eternal stigma. Life was short, uncertain, and sometimes harsh. Why waste a chain to misery? It's a strikingly pragmatic outlook, and perhaps one of the reasons Egyptian society remained relatively stable for so long. Still, stability wasn't universal. Royal marriages were forever entangled in dangerous politics. We've already wandered through sibling marriages, harems, and conspiracies, but it's worth pausing to notice how fragile these dynasties were. The fate of kingdoms turned on jealousies, betrayals, and the private choices of a handful of individuals. A favored concubine might whisper poison in a king's ear. A barren queen might be quietly replaced. A royal child might be declared illegitimate. Behind the gold and marble, family drama simmered endlessly. It makes you wonder how many world-shaping decisions were really made over breakfast arguments. And then there are the curious cases of foreign marriages. Pharaohs occasionally married foreign princesses as part of diplomatic alliances. These unions were often tense. The Egyptian court didn't quite trust outsiders, and the foreign wives sometimes felt isolated in a land where they couldn't even read the hieroglyphs carved on the palace walls. One letter survives from a Hittite princess sent to marry an Egyptian king. She complains bitterly about her loneliness and ill treatment. In that moment, the great marriage alliance looks less like cosmic order and more like a young woman trapped in a gilded cage. Not all unions, divine or not, were happy ones. Yet for every story of jealousy or sadness, there are stories of joy. Couples wrote poems to each other. Husbands left inscriptions praising their wives as beloved and mistress of the house. Wives sometimes spoke proudly of their husbands' achievements, immortalizing them in tomb inscriptions. These glimpses of tenderness suggest that while politics loomed large, love still bloomed in courtyards, over meals, under the desert stars. Even animals entered the sphere of affection and sexuality. Cats, sacred to Batet, were associated with grace and fertility. Lovers might give kittens as gifts. Dogs appear in tomb art, curled loyally at their owner's feet, silent witnesses to household bonds. The presence of animals in love and family life tells us that affection in Egypt wasn't limited to human partners. Homes were alive with pets, their companionship blending with the intimacy of marriage and family. So, after drifting through all this, what picture emerges? Egyptian sex and marriage were never just about romance, nor just about duty. They were both. They were contracts and poems, dowries and flowers, arguments and reconciliations. They were cosmic myths reenacted in temples, and quiet conversations whispered in mud brick houses. They were hopes for children, fears of betrayal, and dreams of eternity. In short, they were as complicated and contradictory as marriage has ever been. And maybe that's the real comfort of this history. The ancient Egyptian, with all their gods and golden tombs, were still just people, falling in love, getting jealous, writing awkward love notes, and sometimes regretting their marriage choices. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear them laughing at festivals, arguing in doorways, or promising eternal devotion in a love poem. They were extraordinary and yet so very ordinary. So let me ask you, if you could choose, would you want your love to follow you into eternity, like the Egyptians dreamed? Or would you prefer a little peace and quiet in the afterlife? Tell me in the comments, because eternity is a long time, and I suspect not everyone would make the same choice. Ahead, we'll wander into more curious corners. How Egyptians used dreams to interpret desire, how sexuality was woven into magic, and how even the gods themselves set questionable examples for mortals. But for now, let the quiet sands of their eternity settle around you, soft and unhurried. Let's drift onward gently into another peculiar space where Egyptian marriage and intimacy intersected with things we'd now file under self-help or alternative wellness. Because the Egyptians, like us, had a habit of turning love and desire into a puzzle to be solved. If something wasn't going well, if a husband strayed, if a wife failed to conceive, if attraction fell uncertain, They reached not for therapy or heart-to-heart talks, but for charms, spells, and dreams. Love, to them, wasn't just emotional. It was magical. And magic could be manipulated. There's an entire genre of Egyptian texts dedicated to love spells. Some were designed to win over a desired partner. Others were meant to keep a wandering spouse faithful. One charm, for instance, instructs a reciter to burn certain herbs while calling on a god to bind the heart of the beloved. The idea was simple: make them think of you constantly. It's the ancient equivalent of changing your crush's Spotify playlist without permission. Subtle manipulation disguised as romance. Some spells got oddly specific. One involves reciting a formula over a wax figurine, then placing it secretly near the person you wanted to attract. Another used knots tied in linen, each knot representing a tie of passion. The more knots, the stronger the love. Egyptians didn't trust chance. They wanted love guaranteed, preferably by supernatural contract. And yes, sometimes these spells were used by women, sometimes by men. Desire was universal, and everyone wanted an edge. But if love could be summoned, it could also be undone. There were spells for cooling passion, for calming jealousy, for severing unwanted ties. A papyrus from the late period contains a recipe for making a spouse less angry. It involves reciting words over a piece of bread, then feeding it to them. Imagine slipping your furious partner a magically infused sandwich and hoping it fixed the argument. Primitive couples therapy, with carbs included. Dreams, too, played a role in love and sex. Egyptians believed dreams were windows into the divine, coded messages about what to expect. Whole dream books survive, where common dreams are listed alongside their meanings. If you dreamed of eating crocodile meat, that meant good fortune in love. If you dreamed of walking naked, that could mean shame or exposure. Dreaming of a cat was a sign of infidelity. These interpretations varied, but the overall theme was clear. The gods whispered their verdict on your romantic life while you slept, which was, admittedly, not always helpful. Imagine waking up and realizing your dream of chasing a goose supposedly predicted an argument with your spouse. The gods themselves modeled this strange interplay of passion and power. We've already spoken of Isis and Osiris and their mythic marriage, but consider Hathor, goddess of love, joy, and beauty. She was often depicted as a cow-headed woman, or sometimes as a full cow, which is not, perhaps, the most alluring imagery to modern eyes. And yet, Hathor embodied sexuality and fertility, and her temples were centers of dance, music, and festival. Couples worshipped her, asking for her blessing. Young people offered her jewelry and flowers, hoping for a nudge in romance. If you wanted love in Egypt, Hathor was your celestial matchmaker. But not all divine love was so wholesome. Set, the god of chaos, was notorious for less-than-ideal behavior. His rivalry with Osiris spilled into personal humiliation and twisted violence. His attempted domination of other gods and myth often carried sexual overtones. These myths, strange and sometimes unsettling, reflected the Egyptians' awareness that love and sex had darker sides: jealousy, aggression, betrayal. They projected these flaws onto their gods, as if to remind themselves that even divine families were dysfunctional. Among humans, dysfunction showed up in papyri too. There are medical texts that read suspiciously like relationship advice. One text offers a remedy for impotence, involving a concoction of herbs ground with honey. Another claims to cure infertility with a poultice of dates and milk. Were they effective? Unlikely. But they show us how Egyptians treated love and desire as practical matters to be managed, like crop irrigation or roof repair. If something broke, you patched it. And sometimes, patching meant consulting professional magicians. Imagine the local wise woman being called in, reciting spells, burning incense, tying amulets. Her work might blur the line between medicine and sorcery. The goal was always the same: to keep relationships balanced, fruitful, and safe. And though it sounds quaint now, is it really so different from modern couples buying self-help books, visiting therapists, or dabbling in astrology apps to see if their partner is really compatible? The technologies change. The insecurities stay the same. It's worth noting, too, that sexuality wasn't only about procreation. The Egyptians wrote love poems that celebrated desire for its own sake. They compared the beloved's body to wine, honey, flowers. They praised kisses, embraces, moments of stolen intimacy. These weren't cold or mechanical. They were sensual and playful. One famous poem has a girl teasing her lover, saying she'll meet him by the riverbank if he can guess which spot. It's flirtation in verse, 3,000 years before texting. But just as often, poetry shaded into anxiety. Some poems plead for fidelity, warning against rivals. Others confess jealousy, describing the pain of seeing a beloved glance at someone else. Here, too, the Egyptians were disarmingly familiar. Strip away the hieroglyphs, and these verses could have been scribbled in the margins of a modern diary. The mixture of sweetness and worry is timeless. Now, while we've been speaking of everyday couples, the royal households were dealing with their own peculiar anxieties. For them, fertility wasn't just personal, it was political. Producing heirs mattered more than affection, which meant that if a queen failed to conceive, pressure mounted quickly. Some queens sought divine intervention, offering lavish gifts at temples, begging Hathor or Isis for a child. Others faced emotion in favor of more fertile wives. In some cases, foreign princesses were imported specifically to expand the king's chances of producing a son. Marriage, in these cases, looked less like companionship and more like a state-sponsored fertility program. But even royal anxiety spilled into magic. One fragmentary text suggests that amulets were placed under royal beds to encourage conception. Another hints at rituals involving sacred oils. All this effort to produce a single boy who might grow up to sit on the throne, though often he grew up to wage disastrous wars or die young of a tooth infection. The irony is hard to miss. And amid all this, one wonders how much room was left for simple affection. Did pharaohs ever sit quietly with their queens, sharing a drink by the Nile, laughing at something trivial? Or was life too crowded with priests, advisors, and expectations? The sources rarely show us those moments. But the few personal inscriptions that survive, where Pharaoh calls his queen beloved, or where a queen praises her husband's gentleness, suggest that even amid grandeur, love slipped through. As for ordinary people, their intimacy carried fewer cosmic burdens. They lived in mud-brick houses, raised children, shared meals. They sang at festivals, flirted in marketplaces, worried about the same small things we worry about: money, loyalty, affection. Their marriage contracts, full of practical details, coexisted with songs that sighed about beauty and longing. They were, in short, both pragmatic and romantic. And that duality of contracts and kisses, spells and songs, duty and desire, sits at the heart of Egyptian love. It wasn't one thing. It was many things, tangled together, shaping lives for centuries. That's why studying their intimacy feels both strange and familiar. It's like looking into an ancient mirror. The shapes are different, but the expressions are the same. So, if you were living in Egypt 3,000 years ago, would you have trusted magic to fix your love life? Would you tie knots in linen, whisper spells over wax dolls, and feed enchanted bread to your partner? Or would you, like some practical souls, just write a sharp letter complaint and hope for the best? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious which approach you'd have taken. And with that question lingering gently in the evening air, we close part 6. Next, we'll drift into how Egyptian art and literature portrayed love. The images they carved, the songs they sang, and the subtle hints of passion left behind on papyrus and stone. Let's drift onward, this time into the art and literature of ancient Egypt, where love and sex were not only lived but also carefully drawn, painted, carved, and sung. Because when people want to remember what matters, they tend to put it into art. And the Egyptians, being very good at making things last thousands of years, left us an archive of intimacy in stone, ink, and pigment. Not all of it polite, not all of it discreet, but all of it deeply human. Start with tomb paintings. We've already mentioned those touching scenes of husbands and wives holding hands, exchanging flowers, and sitting together before piles of bread and beer. These images weren't just decoration. They were wishes made eternal, statement about what the couple hoped to carry with them into the afterlife. And so, they painted themselves not as stern bureaucrats or weary farmers, but as affectionate partners. The men sometimes lean toward their wives. The wives rest a hand on their husband's shoulder. It's almost tender to look at, even though it was painted 3,000 years ago. The details tell us even more. Wives are often shown in elegant dresses, their hair braided, their figure slim. Husbands, too, are drawn younger than they likely were in reality, their bellies conveniently trimmed, their wrinkles erased. Apparently, vanity crosses the centuries. In the tomb, you wanted to look your best. Eternity, after all, is a long time to be stuck with a bad portrait. But tomb art wasn't the only visual record. There are also those rare and controversial scrolls, like the Turin erotic papyrus. Discovered in fragments and carefully pieced together, it depicts sexual scenes so explicit that early archaeologists try to hide it. They decided the Egyptians couldn't possibly have produced pornography. It must be a forgery. Of course, it wasn't. It was just a reminder that people in the past were as amused by bawdy jokes as people today. The papyrus shows couples in inventive poses, sometimes accompanied by humorous captions. It's less reverent temple art and more bedroom comedy. Scholars still debate whether it was meant as satire, as genuine instruction, or just for laughter parties. Whatever its purpose, it proves that Egyptians were not prudish. They laughed about sex. They drew it. They shared it. It was part of their culture, not hidden away in whispered shame. Literature, too, embraced love. Egyptian love poems, written in hieratic script on papyrus or pottery shards, survive from the New Kingdom. They are playful, romantic, sometimes even racy. A girl describes her longing for a boy as if she were ill, unable to eat or sleep until she sees him. A boy compares his beloved to the best wine, intoxicating and irresistible. These poems often use nature as metaphor. The beloved is a lotus flower, a pool of cool water, a patch of shade on a hot day. They're not grand epics, but simple, intimate verses. The kind that make you think someone scratched them out late at night, heartful, pen clumsy, but meaning every word. And then there's music. Though the melodies are lost, the instruments survive. Harps, flutes, tambourines. Scenes in art show women playing harps for men, couples dancing at banquets, guests reclining on mats while wine flowed and music filled the air. These were social spaces where flirtation happened, where glances were exchanged, where perhaps a marriage began with nothing more than a smile across a room. If you picture it, the scene looks remarkably modern, apart from the wigs and the linen kilts. Even the gods made appearances in love songs. A girl might say she longs for a lover the way Isis longed for Osiris. A boy might boast that his strength is like Horus, fierce and victorious. Religion and romance blurred together, which makes sense, because for Egyptians, love was sacred and ordinary all at once. But for all the sweetness, there's also irony in the record. Some poems seem to be written in the voice of someone already married, complaining about being stuck at home while the beloved wanders. Others use humor to deal with jealousy. It's as if Egyptians were perfectly aware that love is not all bliss. It's also boredom, worry, and the occasional desire to strangle your spouse with their own wig. Now, let's return to visual art for a moment, because the Egyptians were also fond of symbolism. The lotus flower, for instance, wasn't just pretty. It represented rebirth, sexuality, and allure. To give someone a lotus was a flirtation. Grapes and wine often stood in for intoxication, a desire. Pools of water, especially with fish, suggested fertility. An image of a couple near a pond wasn't just about gardening. It hinted at far more personal pleasures. Once you see the symbols, Egyptian art starts to look much more suggestive than the museum plaques usually admit. Another fascinating space where art and intimacy met was in amulets. Small charms shaped like the ankh, symbol of life, the jed, symbol of stability, or even less subtle shapes, were worn for protection and fertility. Some were carried during pregnancy, others to ensure sexual potency. One particularly odd amulet is shaped like a phallus with legs, sometimes even wings. The message seems to have been, let the symbol bring strength, protection, and probably a bit of good luck in the bedroom. And yes, museums tend to display these in glass cases with very polite labels, while visitors smirk quietly. Meanwhile, the literature of wisdom texts, those moral instruction manuals copied for centuries, sometimes offered commentary on marriage. One warns men not to neglect their wives, reminding them that a happy household depends on affection. Another cautions against adultery, not because of divine wrath, but because it causes chaos and misery. It's all written in calm, sensible tones, like the advice of an ancient uncle who's seen too many of his friends ruin their lives. Nothing fiery, nothing puritanical. Just practical reminders. Don't cheat, don't neglect, be kind. Advice that could easily appear in any self-help aisle today. And speaking of adultery, let's not ignore how Egyptians treated it. For men, straying was often overlooked. For women, it was riskier, especially if discovered. Yet even here, punishment varied. Some cases ended in divorce, some in scandal, others in shrugs. It depended on class, on connections, on how much the husband cared. The double standard was real, but it was not absolute, which means that behind closed doors, women probably found ways to assert their independence, to make choices, even pursue love outside the rigid rules. History only records a fraction of their stories, but hints suggest they lived more freely than we might assume. Now, one might ask, did Egyptians ever write about heartbreak? The answer is yes, though not often. Some poems describe longing without fulfillment, waiting for a lover who never comes. Others speak of illness caused by desire, a kind of lovesickness that medicine could not cure. These voices sound fragile, human, and strangely familiar. They remind us that even in a culture of arranged marriages and fertility contracts, individuals still yearned, still suffered, still felt the sting of rejection. And perhaps the most poignant thing is how little has changed. The imagery shifts, but the feelings are the same. Replace lotus flower with rose, replace beer with wine, and you could hand one of these poems to a modern reader without much confusion, which means that across 3 millennia, the Egyptians whispered us about love, and we still understand them. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself reclining at an Egyptian banquet. The lamps flicker, the harp plays, wine is poured. Around you, couples flirt and whisper, poems are recited, flowers exchanged. Some unions will last, some will fail, some will become immortalized in tomb art, others will be forgotten by dawn. But for one evening, love hovers in the air, as timeless and restless as ever. And let me ask you, if you could, would you want to read one of those Egyptian love poems aloud to someone today? Or would you feel too shy, worried they'd laugh at your ancient metaphors? Tell me in the comments, because honestly, I think some of those lotus flower comparisons might still work. Next, we'll wander toward family life, how marriages shape households, how children fit into the picture, and how domestic intimacy carried the weight of both joy and exhaustion. Let's drift now into the home itself, because marriage in Egypt didn't exist in isolation. It carried with it the daily work of family life, of raising children, of managing households filled with both affection and frustration. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often picture pharaohs in palaces or priests in temples. But most Egyptians lived in small mud brick houses, often cramped, often hot, filled with noise, chores, and the laughter or crying of children. This was a setting where marriages actually played out. Children were, unsurprisingly, both a blessing and a burden. A large family was considered a gift from the gods, proof that fertility had been granted. Sons were prized for carrying on family names and assisting in labor. Daughters, too, were valued, especially since they could help around the house and eventually bring dowries and alliances. But there was no denying that children added strain. Infants cried in the night, toddlers created chaos, and older children brought their own dramas. One can easily imagine tired Egyptian parents sighing under the desert stars, wondering why they ever thought 4 children was a good idea. Still, affection shines through. In art, mothers cradle infants lovingly, sometimes even breastfeeding depicted in tomb scenes. Fathers are shown holding toddlers, leading them by the hand, or sitting with them at banquets. Childhood was not erased from memory. It was cherished, and in the poems and inscriptions that survive, parents often boast about their children, thanking the gods for granting them healthy offspring. Yet the fragility of life casts a shadow. Child mortality was high. Illness, accidents, and malnutrition claimed many before adulthood. Parents knew this, and the grief of losing a child was common. Some tombs include heartbreaking inscriptions dedicated to children who died too soon. These losses must have tested marriages, straining bonds already pressured by work, money, and survival. The serene tomb paintings of happy families may have been less about reality and more about yearning for perfection that rarely lasted long. Marriage contracts sometimes reflect these family concerns. They stipulate how property would pass to children, what provisions were made for widows, and how dowries would be preserved for daughters. In this way, marriage wasn't just between two people. It was the legal skeleton holding together the larger family structure. One wrong move, an affair, a divorce, an untimely death, and the balance of inheritance could shatter, plunging households into disputes. Lawyers may not have existed in the modern sense, but scribes were busy enough sorting out who got which goats. Then there were the dynamics between co-wives. In polygamous households, more common among the wealthy, rivalries simmered. A man with multiple wives had to balance their needs, their children, and their jealousies. Stories and records hint at bitter competition, particularly if one wife bore sons while another did not. Picture a courtyard filled with women trying to appear serene, while quietly measuring whose child got the better piece of fish at dinner. These tensions no doubt spilled into domestic squabbles, adding more drama than any tomb inscription ever admitted. And yet, despite the challenges, the ideal of the affectionate couple persisted. Songs and poems described love as stronger than wealth, more important than property. Parents taught their children to value respect, loyalty, and kindness in marriage. Wisdom texts remind sons not to neglect their wives, urging them to treat partners with tenderness. Even amid the practical chaos of family life, Egyptians seemed to believe that love could soften the edges. Of course, not all family dynamics were equal. Women in Egypt enjoyed more rights than in many other ancient societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth. But that didn't erase imbalance. Men held more public power. Women bore more domestic responsibility. And the physical toll of repeated pregnancies was immense. Life expectancy for women was often lower than for men, not because they fought wars, but because childbirth was so dangerous. Behind every cheerful depiction of motherhood lay real risks, endured silently. Fathers, meanwhile, were expected to provide stability. A lazy or neglectful husband was condemned in texts as undermining Ma'at, the order of the world. But no doubt some men shirked their duties anyway, leaving wives to juggle endless labor. The contracts may have stipulated fairness, but reality often lagged behind ideals. Human frailty, it seems, was as timeless as love itself. Extended families also shaped marriage. Couples rarely lived entirely alone. Parents, in-laws, siblings, and even cousins might share homes or nearby courtyards. Privacy was minimal. Imagine trying to nurture intimacy when your mother-in-law was cooking loudly 3 feet away, or when siblings wandered in uninvited. Love had to make do in crowded spaces. Perhaps this is why Egyptians value festivals so much, moments when couples could slip into the noise of the crowd, finding a little stolen freedom. And what of the children themselves? They learned early about marriage through observation. Boys watched fathers manage property, discipline, and rituals. Girls learned from mothers the endless work of weaving, cooking, and caring. Playful games often mimicked adult roles. Little girls playing with dolls, little boys imitating craftsmen. By adolescence, they were already prepared for the responsibilities ahead. Some married shockingly young, particularly girls, whose childbearing years were considered too precious to waste. Yet evidence also suggests that many married later, in their late teens or early 20s, once households could be properly arranged. Education also shaped marriage prospects. Boys who learned to read and write could aspire to become scribes, priests, or officials, raising their marriage value. Girls, though less often formally educated, sometimes learn enough literacy to manage accounts, contracts, or correspondence. Marrying a literate woman could be an asset, as she could manage documents when her husband was away. These practical skills were as much a part of marital life as affection or attraction. And then there were the festivals. We've already touched on them, but here let's pause, because they were family occasions as much as romantic ones. Imagine whole households spilling into the streets, children in tow, parents balancing jugs of beer, music echoing through the night. Couples danced, laughed, and argued amid the chaos. Love poems were recited, flirtation sparked, and sometimes new marriages were arranged on the spot. Festivals were Egypt's social glue, weaving family life together in moments of joy and disorder. Of course, festivals also offered chances for mischief. In the anonymity of crowds, affairs could begin. Jealous husbands kept close eyes. Wives traded gossip in clusters. Teenagers lingered at the edges, pretending not to notice each other, while secretly hoping for a glance. Family life in Egypt, like everywhere else, was filled with as much secrecy as openness, as much unspoken tension as spoken joy. And through it all, the expectation remained. Marriage was a foundation. It gave order to households, provided heirs, structured inheritance, and ensured that might extended from cosmic balance into daily life. Without marriage, society felt unstable. With it, Egyptians believed there was hope for harmony, even if harmony often looked more like controlled chaos. So, picture now an ordinary Egyptian evening. A mother weaves by the lamp while her children play at her feet. A father returns from the fields, tired but carrying bread. The couple eats together, laughing softly at the antics of their children. Perhaps they argue about expenses. Perhaps they share a quiet moment of affection. Outside, the desert stretches endlessly, silent and eternal. Inside, love and duty fill the air in equal measure. And so, let me ask you, if you live in that world, would you have wanted a large household with bustling children and extended family everywhere, or would you have longed for a quiet corner of your own? Tell me in the comments, because every couple has its own vision of paradise. Next, we'll drift into the edges of love and morality in Egypt. The taboos, the scandals, the rare but fascinating stories where marriage and sex cross boundaries that even Egyptians found troubling. So far, we've lingered in the calmer waters of Egyptian love. The contracts, the households, the family joys and losses. But marriage and sex are never entirely free of shadows. Every society has its boundaries. The taboos it whispers about, the scandals it pretends didn't happen. Ancient Egypt, for all its sunny imagery and festival songs, was no exception. Love may have been celebrated, but it was also policed. Some behaviors were acceptable, others were dangerous. A few were simply scandalous enough to become legend. Let's start with the idea of fidelity, because the Egyptians seem to talk about it a great deal, which usually means they were also breaking a great deal. In wisdom texts, husbands are warned sternly not to wander after women in the street. Affairs are depicted as tempting but destructive. The common phrase was that adultery ruins a man's name, which sounds almost like advice from a cranky uncle who's been caught once too often. Wives, too, are warned to avoid adultery, though here the consequences were harsher. In many records, a woman accused of infidelity could lose her dowry, her property rights, or even face physical punishment. Husbands, naturally, were treated with more leniency. Fidelity was a moral duty for both, but in practice, the balance tilted in men's favor. Still, affairs happened. The poetry of the New Kingdom is so saturated with longing and secrecy that one suspects more than a few trysts behind granaries or in temple courtyards. One text warns of meeting in hidden corners, which implies that people were indeed meeting in hidden corners. Priests, farmers, scribes, servants, it didn't matter. Desire has never cared much for social status. We can only imagine the whispered excuses, the hurried goodbyes, and inevitable gossip that followed. And gossip was a powerful force. Communities were small, houses close together, walls thin. An affair was rarely private for long. Neighbors noticed patterns, too many visits, too many smiles exchanged. One papyrus even records a court case where an affair between a woman and a servant led to property disputes. The gossip spilled into the legal realm, because scandal had tangible consequences. Reputations meant inheritance, contracts, and marriage prospects. To lose your name was to lose everything. But affairs were not the only taboo. Incestuous relationships, while whispered about, also hovered at the edges of Egyptian marriage. Among the common people, these were rare and frowned upon. But in the royal family, well, That was another matter entirely. Pharaohs were considered divine, descended from the gods. And what did gods famously enjoy? Marrying their siblings. Isis married Osiris, after all, and from that union came Horus. If the gods did it, surely the royals could too. So we find kings marrying sisters, sometimes even daughters, in the name of keeping bloodlines pure. In reality, of course, it just concentrated genetic problems. But divine logic won out over biology. The public seems to have accepted this, or at least tolerated it, as long as it stayed confined to the throne. For ordinary Egyptians, marrying your sister would have been scandalous, even revolting. The law codes don't directly ban it, but the silence suggests it was so taboo it didn't need spelling out. A bit like writing a rule today that says, don't eat light bulbs. Technically possible, rarely attempted, socially condemned. Then there were more subtle taboos, things like seducing priests or crossing boundaries of ritual purity. Priests and temple staff were meant to embody order, to keep themselves clean, to serve the gods without distraction. But some records hint that they were not immune to temptation. The Westcar papyrus tells a tale of Pharaoh catching his wife secretly with another man, while some funerary texts warn against priests consorting with women during periods of ritual duty. These rules probably existed because people kept breaking them. If no one ever committed the offense, no one would have bothered writing it down. Homosexuality, too, floated in this ambiguous space. Egyptians didn't leave clear explicit laws condemning same-sex relationships, unlike later societies. But some texts suggest unease. One of the most famous examples is the story of Horus and Set, in which Set tries to humiliate Horus by sexually dominating him. The tone of the tale is mocking, using the act as an insult, not as a neutral detail. From this, scholars infer that homosexual behavior may have been associated with shame or mockery. Yet at the same time, tombs exist where two men are buried together, depicted with the same affection usually reserved for a husband and wife. Were they brothers? Were they lovers? The ambiguity remains, but it suggests that life was probably more complicated than official morality admitted. Another thorny subject was prostitution. Egypt almost certainly had it, though the evidence is indirect. Temples of Hathor, goddess of love and sexuality, sometimes included references to priestesses who entertained men in ways not strictly ritual. Contracts mention women described as musicians or concubines in contexts that hint at sex work. Yet the Egyptians never created a clear legal category for prostitution, leaving it to lurk in the margins. Some men boasted of visiting the house of women. Others condemned it as dangerous, both morally and medically. In wisdom literature, young men are warned not to spend their nights chasing women in taverns. Proof that many young men were spending their nights chasing women in taverns. And then there were the crimes of passion. Jealousy, rage, betrayal, they happened then as they do now. Court records reveal accusations of attempted poisonings, thefts of dowries, and husbands accusing wives of witchcraft. In one notorious case, a woman conspired with her lover to assassinate her husband. The plot failed, but it shows just how far scandals could spiral. Marriage, for all its poetry and contracts, could also be a battlefield. And sometimes the battlefield was bloody. Infertility brought its own quiet scandal. In a world where children were proof of divine blessing, a couple without heirs was suspect. Was the wife barren? Was the husband cursed? Remedies range from herbal concoctions to prayers, to spells written on papyrus and swallowed in wine. Some remedies sound almost reasonable. Others are best left unimagined, involving animal parts and strange rituals. Couples desperate for children often endured ridicule, no matter how devout they were. In the quiet corners of society, infertility whispered like a shameful secret, eroding marriages from within. And what about divorce itself? We've seen it was possible, even straightforward. But in practice, divorce carried a shadow of scandal. To separate meant to admit failure, to confess that love, or at least duty, had collapsed. Divorced women were sometimes pitted, sometimes gossiped about. Divorced men might be mocked for poor judgment. The practicalities were clear in contracts, but the social sting lingered. Imagine returning to a festival as a divorced woman, facing the knowing looks of neighbors. Freedom Yes, but also the heavy silence of lost respect. So, in the end, Egyptian marriage was both celebrated and fragile. It existed within a web of rules, expectations, and taboos that people bent, broke, and endured. Love was praised in poems, but threatened by jealousy. Fidelity was urged in texts, but often ignored in practice. Taboos were whispered about, broken in palaces, if not in villages. The truth, as always, was that humans are inconsistent. Egyptians wanted stability, but they also wanted passion. They wanted order, but also the thrill of crossing boundaries. And those contradictions are what make their marriages look so familiar today. Now, if you were living in that world, bound by gods and contracts, festivals and family, would you have been the one sneaking into hidden corners for a forbidden meeting? Or would you have clung tightly to order, terrified of scandal? Tell me in the comments, because every choice has its cost. And with that, we drift out of part 9. Next, we'll flow into part 10, where we look at the rituals, the spiritual beliefs, and how sex and marriage weren't just personal matters, but cosmic ones, echoes of creation itself in the eyes of the Egyptians. We wander through contracts, households, scandals, and all the little dramas that make marriages human. But for the Egyptians, love and sex weren't simply personal. They were woven into the fabric of the cosmos itself. Every kiss, every union, every child born wasn't just biology. It was, in some way, a reenactment of creation. That may sound lofty, but remember, this was a culture where the sun god rose each morning by defeating chaos, where the flooding of the Nile was a sacred cycle, and where even the act of farming was layered with meaning. Marriage and intimacy were no different. The gods, after all, had set the example. The great creation myths almost always involved some form of intimacy. Adam, the self-created God, was said to have brought the world into being through an act of, let's say, very private self-expression. The texts are surprisingly blunt about this. Creation itself began with a God who, finding himself alone, improvised. And from that solitary moment came the first divine children, Shu and Tefnut, who in turn produced Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. When Egyptians thought about fertility, they weren't imagining sterile abstractions. They were picturing the very literal body of the gods at work. Then there was Osiris and Isis, the archetypal divine couple. Their marriage became the model for human unions, devoted, loyal, but also scarred by loss. When Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set, Isis gathered his pieces, reassembled him, and briefly brought him back to life. Long enough, the myths tell us, to conceive Horus. It's a rather morbid love story, but one that Egyptians cherished. Love and sex, it suggested, were stronger than death, powerful enough to bridge even the grave. Every Egyptian couple who held each other close at night could imagine themselves echoing the devotion of Isis, keeping order alive through their union. And let's not forget Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, and intoxication. She was a joy in marriage, the laughter at festivals, the playful energy in love songs. Temples to Hathor sometimes included small shrines where couples might leave offerings for fertility or happiness. Her presence reminds us that intimacy wasn't always serious or cosmic. It was also meant to be fun. Egyptians didn't shy away from the lighter side of sex, at least when Hathor's name was invoked. After all, a marriage filled only with contracts and heirs would have been unbearably dull. This divine framework filtered down into rituals. Fertility rites often involve symbolic unions of gods and goddesses, reenacted by priests in temple ceremonies. Sometimes statues of deities were paraded through streets, meeting each other in symbolic encounters that promised renewed abundance. The union of gods mirrored the union of humans. When couples came together, they weren't just enjoying private moments. They were, in the Egyptian mind, contributing to the balance of Ma'at, the order of the universe. And because of this, sex carried ritual power. Certain spells and charms focus explicitly on intimacy. We found amulets carved with fertility symbols, prayers whispered over beds, and instructions in magical papyri for increasing desire or ensuring conception. Some were practical, others less so. One charm advises placing an image of Hathor beneath the bed, so that the goddess herself might bless the act. Another suggests drinking mixtures that would stir the body like wine. Whether these worked or not, the act of trying shows how sacred intimacy was to them. Marriage itself could be seen as a kind of daily ritual. Husbands and wives, by sharing a home, producing children and supporting each other, were participating in the cosmic cycle. A stable household mirrored the stability of the heavens. A quarrelsome, broken household? That was a small eruption of Isfit, chaos. No wonder wisdom texts constantly reminded men to treat their wives kindly and wives to be loyal. To keep peace in the home was, in its own way, to help keep peace in the universe. And here's where things get quietly amusing. The Egyptians left prayers for fertility, spells for passion, hymns for divine unions. Yet at the same time, they were perfectly willing to complain about each other in letters and contracts. One can imagine a man storming out after an argument, only to stop at a shrine and pray earnestly to Hathor for more affection at home. Humans are nothing if not contradictory. Dreams, too, carried a sacred weight in marriage. In the dream book Papyrus, different visions are interpreted, many of them tied to love and sex. Dreaming of embracing someone could be a sign of good fortune. Dreaming of lying with a stranger might suggest scandal on the horizon. Couples probably lay awake recounting their dreams to each other, half in jest, half in fear what they might mean. Even in sleep, intimacy was bound up with divine signs. And let's drift briefly into the afterlife, because for Egyptians, love didn't stop at death. Couples who could afford elaborate tombs often included inscriptions hoping for reunion in eternity. Husbands and wives are depicted side by side, sharing bread and wine forever, strolling through fields of reeds together. Even poorer Egyptians sometimes left tokens in graves, whispers of hope that love would continue beyond the grave. Sex, too, was not forgotten. Some fertility charms were buried with the dead, ensuring that even in eternity, vitality and pleasure would endure. It's both touching and a little humorous to think of eternity planned not just for farming or worshiping, but for affection as well. The cosmic view of intimacy also shows up in agriculture. Farmers understood the fertility of the Nile as a sexual metaphor. The annual flooding was described as the river embracing the land. Hymns praised the Nile for filling the earth with seed, ensuring crops would grow. Each harvest was, in a sense, another divine marriage between river and soil. Couples living along the banks must have felt this symbolism keenly, watching the waters rise and fall, as if the gods themselves were reminding them of love cycles. Yet, as lofty as this all sounds, everyday Egyptians probably mixed reverence with pragmatism. Fertility rites were followed not just out of devotion, but out of desperation. Children meant survival. Crops meant food. The rituals gave comfort, a sense of control in a world where so much was uncertain. When intimacy faltered, when pregnancies failed, or when marriages soured, the rituals provided a way to hope again, to plead with the gods for harmony. And so, in this sacred landscape, the bedroom was not just a private place. It was a miniature temple. The household itself was a sacred space, with protective gods watching over thresholds, fertility charms hung on walls, and prayers whispered before sleep. A marriage was more than a contract. It was a daily negotiation with the divine, one where every act of kindness, every embrace, every quarrel mattered to balance the world. Picture it now. A couple lying together in a small mud brick home, oil lamp flickering, a carved amulet of Hathor hanging nearby. Outside, the desert wind stirs. Inside, the rhythm of their breath echoes the rhythms of creation itself. To them, this is not only love. It is the same pulse that brought the sun across the sky and the river into flood. Marriage in Egypt was never just human. It was eternal. So, if you found yourself in that world, would you have placed more faith in contracts and property or in charms and prayers? Would you whisper to Hathor at night, hoping she heard? Tell me in the comments, because every culture answers these questions in its own way. Next, we'll drift into part 11, where the daily humor, awkwardness, and sometimes absurdity of Egyptian married life comes into focus, the side that feels perhaps the most familiar to us today. We've floated through contracts, gods, fertility rites, and scandals, but we haven't yet given enough space to the most quietly amusing part of Egyptian marriage, the awkward, messy, ordinary, and often funny details of life together. Because for all the poetry carved into stone, marriage was also about snoring, grumbling, awkward silences, and those tiny moments that tomb artists politely left out. And in those moments, the Egyptians feel less like distant figures on papyrus and more like neighbors down the street. Imagine the house of a newly married couple. The ceremony, modest though it was, has ended. The dowry is recorded. The gifts from family are packed into corners. Jars of beer, a few pieces of linen, maybe even a goat of relatives were feeling generous. And then the real adjustment begins. Two people who perhaps only known each other briefly are suddenly expected to share everything. Food, bed, space, moods. One can almost see the sighs in the night as one partner rolls over, wondering how on earth they're supposed to fall asleep in the suffocating heat with someone else's elbow digging into their ribs. The Egyptians, being practical, didn't ignore these difficulties. Letters survive in which spouses complain to each other. A husband away on duty writes to his wife, begging her not to be angry. A wife writes back, scolding him for neglect. Sometimes the tone is sweet, sometimes sour. In one letter, a man tries to placate his wife by promising new clothes if she will just stop being upset. It's strangely modern. Ancient Egyptians, too, attempted the time-honored method of fixing problems with gifts. There was also humor in festivals and flirtations. Songs describe young men boasting of their strength, comparing themselves to bulls, while women tease them in return. Some poems are surprisingly cheeky, full of double meanings and sly smiles. Picture an Egyptian couple at a festival. The husband perhaps drinking too much beer, trying to sing along to hymns, the wife laughing at his clumsy dancing. Later, neighbors gossip about it for weeks. Even in a society where cosmic order was sacred, people still found time to laugh at each other's antics. Work, too, created friction. Most marriages were not lives of leisure. Men worked long hours in fields, quarries, or workshops. Women wove, baked, brewed, fetched water, and tended children. At the end of the day, exhaustion must have dampened romance. One can imagine husbands dragging themselves home, collapsing into silence, while wives try to engage them in conversation. Domestic quarrels were probably as common then as now, even if they weren't immortalized on temple walls. Children added to the comedy, as well as the chaos. Tomb scenes show children tugging at their parents, climbing onto laps, or squabbling with siblings. Parents must have struggled to keep order. Imagine a father trying to lecture his children on Mott, cosmic order, while one toddler screams and another throws figs at the wall. So much for divine harmony. These little domestic absurdities were surely part of marriage, though the official art preferred to show well-behaved offspring instead. And of course, there were the moments of jealousy. Marriage contracts tried to keep peace by promising fidelity and fairness, but in practice, human emotions made things complicated. There must have been sulking wives after a husband spent too much time at taverns. There must have been sulking husbands after wives ignored them in favor of family gossip. Couples probably perfected the silent treatment millennia before we did. The gods may have set examples, but humans, as always, preferred improvisation. Food also played its role in both harmony and friction. Meals were a central part of family life. Bread, beer, fish, vegetables, all shared daily. A wife might pride herself on her brewing, only to endure grumbles if the beer came out weak. A husband might boast of catching a fine fish, only for his children to devour it before his wife got a taste. Shared meals could be joyful, but they could also spark quarrels. Nothing unites a family faster than food, and nothing divides them faster than an uneven slice of bread. Then there were in-laws. The Egyptians did not live in neat nuclear families. Extended relatives hovered constantly. Parents might move in. Brothers might share houses. Cousins might drop by uninvited. Privacy was rare. Marriages were not just unions of two people. They were collisions of entire families. One can picture a weary husband trudging home after work, only to find his wife's cousin sprawled across his mat, loudly telling stories. Or a young wife enduring endless advice from her mother-in-law about how she should manage the household. Ancient patience must have been tested daily. Even in the afterlife, humor crept into love. Some tomb inscriptions include not just praise but sly reminders. A husband promises his wife eternal companionship, but also slips in a note about her temper. A wife blesses her husband with eternal health, while perhaps hinting that he ought to remember his promises better in the next life. The Egyptians had no problem blending devotion with mild sarcasm, even in stone. And through it all, affection persisted. Couples may have quarreled, sulked, or teased, but love remained visible. Letters end with phrases like, "Be well, my sister. Do not worry, my heart. I am yours in body and spirit." Husbands and wives refer to each other with tenderness, even when tempers flared. In a world filled with dust, toil, and uncertainty, affection was a steady anchor. The laughter, the bickering, the little annoyances, they were all part of the fabric of love. Picture now an ordinary evening in Egypt. The oil lamp burns low. Children have finally fallen asleep, sprawled in corners. The wife sits weaving, humming softly. The husband stretches, tired but content. Perhaps they've argued earlier, perhaps they've laughed, but now they sit quietly together, sharing bread, sharing silence. No temple hymn or royal decree could capture that moment, but for them, it was everything. So, if you had lived then, do you think you'd have found marriage more challenging, the endless chores, the crowded households, or more comforting, with laughter, family, and small joys woven through every day? Tell me in the comments, because the answers are never simple. Next, we'll drift into the final part 12, where we gather all these threads together, the cosmic, the personal, the humorous, and the tragic, and reflect on how the Egyptians, for all their differences, lived and loved in ways still strangely familiar. We've wandered a long way together, haven't we? From dusty temples and contracts written in careful ink, to festival songs, awkward silences, and the quiet laughter of families trying to hold themselves together. And now, as the oil lamps of our journey burn low, it's time to gather these threads into one final picture. If there's one thing the Egyptians remind us, it's that love has always been both sacred and ordinary. They imagine their gods falling in love, quarreling, reconciling, and protecting the world through bonds of affection. They wrote contracts to make marriage firm, but they also wrote songs that teased and blushed with playful desire. They carved their devotion in stone, yet still had to argue about bread, children, and in-laws. Marriage, for them, was not a grand ceremony. It was a daily act, lived in small rooms with clay jars and woven mats. It was laughter over shared meals, comfort in hard times, quarrels mended by gifts or gentle words. And though they dreamed of eternity, they understood that the simplest joys mattered most. A spouse's voice, a child's smile, the warmth of company at the end of a long day. In the end, the Egyptians built pyramids and temples, wrote hymns and prayers, yet what they treasured most in writing, in letters and songs, was love, messy, fragile, and enduring. They knew that no wall of stone, no God's decree, could outlast the simple bond of two people choosing to share a life. And perhaps that's the lesson they leave us with. We are not so different from them. We still quarrel, laugh, tease, and reconcile. We still search for affection, still anchor ourselves in family, still stumble through awkward moments and find joy in the smallest gestures. Thousands of years may stand between us and them, but the heart has changed very little. So, as you let your eyes close tonight, think of them, not as distant figures in painted tombs, but as neighbors across time, a young wife humming by a lamp, a weary husband sharing bread, children giggling in the dark, love that felt ordinary to them, but to us feels timeless. And if you had lived then, would you have carved your love in stone, or left it in a letter, folded carefully, waiting for someone to read it thousands of years later? Tell me in the comments what stood out most to you in this long journey through ancient Egypt. And if you've enjoyed this quiet wander, remember to subscribe for more bedtime history, where the past is a lullaby and the world slows down one story at a time. Good night, sleep well, and may love in all its ordinary beauty keep you steady, just as it did for them.